I'm Galip Talay, Research Director at Sharq Forum. Today in Istanbul at Conrad Hotel, we have been participating at 2 days event on violent extremism in the MENA region, which was co-organized by Sharq Forum and Afro Middle East Center from South Africa. Within the framework of this conference, we have here Monica Marks, who is a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University, but also a visiting fellow with European Council on Foreign Relations. We'll be talking about this issue of foreign fighters within the context of Tunisia. Monica, welcome.
Thank you.
Monica, one of the prevalent wisdom, one of the prevalent thinking is that the best antidote against the radicalism is opening the political space. Putting it more clearly, the way to tackle with the violent Islamist movement is to open the political space for the democratic political Islamist project, and this will reduce the appetite of people to go for the radical movements. But the paradox is that in Tunisia, which is a relatively success story of the Arab Spring, which is relatively has an open political space, but at the same time, Tunisia is proportionally sending the highest number of foreign fighters to Syria and Iraq to fight. So how do you explain this paradox? On the one hand, you have a relatively open political space, but on the other hand, you see the appetite for joining the radical movement is still there.
Yeah, absolutely. So you hear some critics of Tunisian democracy, let's say, or the revolution in Tunisia, say that the fact that you have such a proportionally high number of Tunisians going to fight disproves this idea of political inclusion as an antidote, or disproves what political scientists often call the inclusion moderation hypothesis. That's just a fancy way of saying that when you include people in the political process, encouraging them to vote, to support a political party, etc., that naturally they're going to understand that politics is about compromise, that you can get what you want without being violent, and that after a while everyone moderates, people move towards the center, and things stabilize. I don't think Tunisia has properly tested the inclusion moderation hypothesis. I'll explain that more, but I also think that political freedom of expression is only one half of the battle. You also need strong institutions and strong rule of law. And in Tunisia, when the revolution happened in 2011, to be honest, you didn't have either. Tunisia's institutions for decades had been weakened by dictatorship. The Tunisian state was shaped kind of like a pyramid under Ben Ali. Ben Ali, the old dictator, stood at the top of the pyramid, and he made sure that all the different ministries and the police and the foreign affairs and all the bureaucracy, the accountants, etc., that they reported to him, and that their primary role was to ensure the strength of his regime. So that's not to say that before the revolution you didn't have very skilled bureaucrats or diplomats in Tunisia, that you didn't have any meritocracy. You did, but the primary function of many state institutions was to empower Ben Ali, who was a very corrupt, kleptocratic dictator. So instead of having strong institutions that work to promote rule of law, or instead of having a police that was skilled in forensics and skilled in making crime A lead to punishment B, instead you had a political police, which in Tunisia they call police siyasi, elsewhere in the Arabic world they call it mukhabarat. And the main goal of this political police was to attack people who were criticizing Ben Ali, right? So when the revolution happened, you had a situation in a lot of government ministries where people on the same floor of the ministry, people who worked not only in the same building, but on the same level of the building, wouldn't necessarily know what the other one was doing. They weren't using modern communication methods like email. The bureaucracy was extremely heavy, and it was twisted so that one arm of the bureaucracy wouldn't know what the other arm was doing. And in many ways, that's what Ben Ali wanted, because he wanted to be the head, the only head. So this, of course, created a situation after the revolution where it was very difficult to have efficient rule of law-oriented institutions. After the revolution, there was an election in October of the same year, 2011, and this election brought a three-party coalition government to power. The party with the most votes, a plurality, not a majority, was an Islamist party, center-right Islamist party called Ennahda, which means the Renaissance. And it governed in a three-party coalition with two smaller secular parties. When they were choosing the government ministers, Ennahda in the Ministry of Interior, which was the most corrupt and black and corroded of all the ministries, that was the ministry that governed the police in a police state. To be minister of that ministry, they appointed a man named Ali Al-Rayed, who himself had been tortured in the basement of that building. And in January 2012, he walks into the building as a minister. So you can imagine that even though that was a very inspiring revolutionary symbol for many people, that a man like Ali Al-Rayed would have a lot of trouble governing that ministry. He'd have trouble governing a ministry in which people had been taught to view all Islamists as terrorists. So this is just one anecdote to illustrate a broader difficulty that the newly elected three-party Troika coalition had in actually governing the state, in making the state work. At the same time, you had a lot of freedom of expression, freedom of religious expression and political expression like you'd never seen in Tunisia before. And on one hand, this was an excellent thing, and let Tunisians breathe in a country where they'd been so tightly suffocated for so long. But on the other hand, to have so much freedom of expression without strong rule of law, without strong institutions, created a system in which violent forms of expression could become more vocal. So in 2011 and 2012, for example, you started seeing some young people who identified as Salafi jihadis getting violent. Now, not all of them were violent, but some of them did certain violent things like maybe attack liquor stores, or attack hotels that serve liquor, or harass women who they felt were dressed un-Islamically. And instead of being punished, most of these actions were not punished at all. And a lot of people started asking, why isn't the government punishing these actions? And I think part of the answer was that the rule of law system wasn't properly working. The government was very new. It was very confused. The government had been very naive about the problem. But another part of the problem was that the Salafi jihadi issue was it was very poorly understood, right? And the problem was downplayed for a long time. Eventually, the government declared Ansar al-Sharia, the biggest Salafi jihadi group in Tunisia. They declared it a terror organization in 2013. But many critics said this was too little too late. And so what the critics said, and what many of the critics are saying now, is that these people were always violent, and there was no point trying to include them in the political process. But I think we have to view that argument critically, because if there had been rule of law in Tunisia to take criminal actions and punish those criminal actions, I don't see as much reason why there couldn't have been freedom of radical political expression, even violent ideas, as long as violent actions weren't taken. But you never really saw that experiment play out. And that experiment was cut short, partially because politically the situation was so difficult for Ennahda, the Islamist party. Because a lot of critics said that Ennahda was supporting Salafi jihadis, and it became politically impossible for Ennahda to not declare Ansar al-Sharia a terrorist movement. And when they did that, it kind of cut the experiment short. You see what I mean? So this didn't fully play out. It was also a very difficult environment in Tunisia because it intersected with the regional rise of ISIS. And this has been one of the biggest destabilizing trends that we've seen in the Middle East in a long time. So these things complicated the situation.
So basically you are saying that this inclusion moderation theory did not have enough time, or did not have the permissive context to really take root.
Yeah, to summarize, to summarize, there wasn't the right context to test the inclusion moderation hypothesis with radical Salafis. And I'm sure in any society you'll always have some radicals who will do violence, and those people must be punished through a rule of law-based judicial system. But many of these young people who were in Ansar al-Sharia weren't violent. And by declaring Ansar al-Sharia a terrorist organization, it did push many of these people further underground. But the context wasn't right because of the institutional weakness, the lack of rule of law, the fact that you had an Islamist government that was getting killed politically for letting these people exist, and you had a regional fire that kept pulling all of these people. So it was very difficult, but I don't think that anything that happened in Tunisia should make us fundamentally question the efficacy of political inclusion. Yeah.
Monica, it was a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, thanks, Khalid.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.